Mom! That's the human who saved me! The little alien girl whispered, and the alien queen fell to his knees. The storm rolled low across the frontier like a wounded beast. Dark clouds swallowed the evening sky above the lonely ranch, turning the distant hills black beneath fading strips of gold sunlight. Wind pushed through the dry grass and rattled the crooked wooden fences surrounding the property. Somewhere beyond the barn, horses shifted nervously in their stalls as thunder rolled across the valley. The ranch sat alone miles from the nearest town. Most people preferred it that way. They said the man living there had once killed 6 outlaws in a single night with nothing but a revolver and a hunting knife. Others whispered he had fought in the old frontier wars against alien raiders beyond the northern territories. Some swore he buried his wife and son with his own hands after a massacre near the river settlements. No one knew which stories were true. But everyone knew this. The scarred rancher wanted to be left alone. He stood beside a chopping block near the cabin porch, shirtless beneath the cold wind, muscles tense beneath skin lined with old scars. Some marks were thin and pale with age. Others looked deep enough to have nearly killed him. Sweat glistened across his chest despite the chill as he drove the axe downward again. Crack! The logs split clean in half. Wood chips burst across the dirt. His dark hair hung damp around his face, moving slightly with the wind. He paused only long enough to breathe before reaching for another log. That was when he heard it. Not thunder. Not horses. Footsteps. Small ones? The rancher slowly lifted his head. Near the entrance gate stood 2 figures beneath the storm-dark sky. A woman. And a child. Neither looked human. The woman's skin carried a soft pale green glow beneath the fading light, unnatural against the dusty frontier landscape. Her silver-white hair rested messily against her shoulders, tangled from long travel. She wore a worn brown frontier dress covered in dust and mud near the hem. Beside her stood a tiny alien girl no older than 6. Her small hand clutched the woman's fingers tightly. The child stared at the rancher with wide silver eyes full of fear and recognition. For a long moment, nobody moved. Wind creaked the old wooden gate behind them. The rancher narrowed his eyes slightly. They looked exhausted. Starving. The woman's breathing seemed uneven, as though she had spent days running without rest. Dirt streaked her face. One sleeve of her dress had been torn near the shoulder. The child's tiny boots were nearly falling apart. Travelers sometimes crossed the frontier. Alien travelers rarely survived it. Especially women and children alone. The rancher rested the axe head against the chopping block. "Your loss," he said coldly. His voice sounded rough from disuse. The alien woman lowered her gaze cautiously, as though expecting violence. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said softly. Her accent sounded strange but elegant, like someone trying carefully to shape human words correctly. The rancher's eyes shifted toward the little girl. And suddenly, the child pointed directly at him. Tiny trembling fingers extended toward the scarred man standing in the dust. Her lips parted. "Mom!" she whispered quietly. The rancher felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. "That's the human who saved me." Silence swallowed the ranch. Even the wind seemed to stop. The rancher stared at the child. Recognition hit him like a bullet. Months earlier, near the northern frontier settlements, smoke had filled the sky after a brutal raid. Burning wagons littered the ground while armed bounty hunters searched the ruins for survivors. He remembered hearing crying beneath an overturned supply cart. He remembered finding a terrified alien child trapped beneath broken wood and dead bodies. Silver eyes. White hair. The same child. At the time, he should have walked away. Most men would have. Helping alien survivors usually earned a bullet in the back or a rope around the neck in nearby towns. Frontier people still carried hatred from the old wars. But he had seen fear in the child's eyes. Real fear. Not the fear of soldiers. The fear of a little girl waiting to die alone. So he pulled the wagon off her with bleeding hands. He gave her water from his canteen. Then when bounty hunters approached the ruins, He hid her beneath his coat and led them the wrong direction through the hills before leaving her beside a safe caravan trail at dawn. He never expected to see her again. Yet here she stood at his gate beneath the storm. Alive. The little girl suddenly smiled weakly through exhausted tears. "I told you he was real," she whispered to her mother. The alien woman looked stunned. Her eyes slowly returned to the rancher, searching his scarred face carefully now. "You," she said quietly. "You were the one who carried her from the fires?" The rancher said nothing. Thunder rumbled across the plains. The woman lowered her head slightly. "Then I owe you more than my life." "I didn't save you," he answered flatly. "I saved the kid." The child stepped slightly forward. Her small feet barely disturbed the dirt. "You gave me water," she said softly. "And you covered me with your jacket because I was cold." The rancher looked away first. Something about hearing her remember those details unsettled him more than it should have. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. At once, fear returned to the woman's face. She glanced nervously toward the dark hills behind them. "They're still hunting us," she admitted quietly. The rancher's eyes sharpened instantly. "Who?" The woman hesitated. Then, "Men working for people far worse than bounty hunters." Lightning flashed across the valley. For the first time, the rancher noticed bruising around her wrists beneath the sleeves. Not old bruises. Fresh ones. The little girl pressed closer against her mother's side. "They'll kill us if they find us again," the child whispered. The rancher cursed under his breath. This was exactly the kind of trouble he had spent years avoiding. He didn't want strangers. Didn't want wars. Didn't want aliens near his land. Most of all, he didn't want to care. "Town's east," he said firmly. "You can rest there." The woman's expression fell instantly. "They won't help us," she said. "They'll sell us." He knew she was probably right. The frontier could be merciless even to humans. To alien refugees? Worse. The rancher looked toward the darkening horizon. Storm winds were growing stronger now. Rain would arrive soon. The little girl suddenly swayed slightly from exhaustion. Before she could fall, the rancher caught her instinctively. She felt frighteningly light in his arms. Too light. The child blinked up at him sleepily. For a second, he remembered another small body years ago. Another child he had failed to protect. Pain crossed his face so quickly it almost vanished before the woman noticed. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday," the alien mother admitted quietly. The rancher closed his eyes briefly. "Damn it." Without another word, he carried the child toward the cabin porch. The woman stood frozen in disbelief. "You can stay in the barn tonight," he said harshly without looking back. "Leave by sunrise." The alien mother's eyes filled with visible relief. "Thank you," she whispered. But the rancher didn't answer. Because deep down, he already feared this was the beginning of something far worse than a single stormy night. Rain hammered the ranch roof through most of the night. Cold wind howled across the valley, rattling shutters and bending the dry grass flat beneath the storm. Inside the barn lantern light flickered softly while the horses shifted uneasily in their stalls. The scarred rancher barely slept. He sat alone at the cabin table cleaning his revolver beneath dim lantern glow, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds coming from the barn nearby. Strangers. Aliens. Trouble. Every instinct told him to send them away before sunrise. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the little girl collapsing from exhaustion in his arms. Near midnight, he finally stood and walked outside into the rain. The barn smelled of wet hay, horses, and smoke from the small fire he had lit earlier. The alien woman sat awake against the wooden wall while her daughter slept wrapped in old blankets nearby. The woman immediately tensed when he entered. "You should rest," she said quietly. "So should you." The rancher leaned against the stall gate. "Who's hunting you?" The woman hesitated again. He noticed she did that often, as if measuring every word carefully before speaking. Finally she answered. "Men loyal to a warlord." "That tells me nothing." Her silver eyes lowered toward the sleeping child. They won't stop until they find her. The rancher followed her gaze. The little girl slept curled tightly beneath the blanket, tiny fingers still clutching part of his old coat. Even in sleep, she looked afraid. Thunder rolled across the valley. Then, the horses suddenly became restless. The rancher's eyes sharpened instantly. He heard it too. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders. Fast. The alien woman stood immediately, panic flooding her face. They found us. The rancher moved without hesitation. Lantern light flashed across the steel of his revolver as he stepped toward the barn doors and looked through the cracks into the storm-dark night. Riders. At least 8. Spreading across the hills surrounding the ranch. Not townsmen. Hunters. You stay inside, he said coldly. The woman grabbed his arm before he could leave. There are too many. I've seen worse. Then he stepped into the rain. Lightning split the sky behind him. The riders approached slowly through the storm, faces hidden beneath soaked hats and dark coats. 2 weren't even human. Their pale armored skin reflected faint blue beneath the rain. Bounty hunters. The lead rider stopped near the fence. We know they're here, he shouted over the storm. Hand over the woman and the child, old man. This doesn't concern you. The rancher stood motionless beside the chopping block. Rain rolled down the scars across his chest. You're on my land, he answered. That makes it my concern. One of the riders laughed. Move aside before you die for creatures that ain't your kind. The rancher slowly cocked the revolver. I said, he growled, you're on my land. The first gunshot exploded through the storm. Chaos followed instantly. The rancher moved like a ghost born from violence itself. A rider fell from his horse before the others even realized he had fired. Another bullet shattered a lantern, throwing sparks and darkness across the yard. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The alien woman watched from inside the barn with stunned disbelief. This was no ordinary rancher. He fought like someone who had survived hell too many times to fear it anymore. One hunter rushed through the gate with a shotgun. The rancher met him halfway. A brutal punch dropped the man into the mud before the rancher tore the weapon from his hands and fired toward another rider near the fence. Thunder and gunfire merged together beneath the storm. The little alien girl woke crying softly beneath the blankets. Mama! The woman pulled her close while listening to the violence outside. Then, silence. Only rain remained. Breathing hard, the rancher stood alone in the muddy yard surrounded by fallen men and fleeing horses. One hunter crawled weakly through the dirt before the rancher grabbed his collar violently. Who sent you? The terrified man spat blood. You have no idea who that child is. The rancher's eyes darkened. Then explain it. But the hunter only smiled weakly. She belongs to the stars. A distant rifle shot suddenly echoed from the hills. The bullet slammed into the rancher's shoulder. The force spun him sideways. Inside the barn, the alien woman gasped in horror. More hunters. Snipers hidden beyond the valley. The rancher gritted his teeth through the pain, grabbed the wounded hunter, and dragged him into cover beside the woodpile before firing toward the ridge. The sniper vanished into darkness. After several tense minutes, the remaining riders retreated into the storm. Gone. The ranch fell quiet again. Rainwater mixed with blood beneath the mud. The alien woman rushed outside with the child close behind her. The rancher sat against the porch steps, gripping his bleeding shoulder tightly. You're hurt, she whispered. I noticed. Despite the pain, his eyes searched the hills instead of his wound. Always watching. Always expecting death to return. The little girl approached him slowly. Tiny tears rolled down her cheeks. You got hurt because of me. The rancher looked at her for a long moment. Then surprisingly, he reached out and gently brushed wet silver hair from her face. I've had worse. The child smiled faintly through tears. That small smile did something dangerous to him. It softened places inside him he had buried years ago. Over the next few days the storm passed, but the danger remained. The woman and child stayed hidden at the ranch while the rancher guarded the property constantly. Slowly, life around the ranch changed. The little girl followed him everywhere. She sat beside him while he repaired fences. She laughed softly while feeding chickens near the barn. She asked endless questions about horses, rifles, mountains, and stars. One afternoon she touched a scar across his ribs carefully. "Did this one hurt?" The rancher gave a dry laugh. "Only a little." "You're lonely," she said innocently. The words hit harder than bullets. Nearby, her mother watched quietly from the porch. For the first time since arriving, fear in her eyes had begun to fade. One night beneath a sky overflowing with stars, the truth finally came. The rancher sat near the fire cleaning a saddle, while the alien woman stood silently beside the fence staring upward. "The stars where I was born," she whispered, "shine blue instead of silver." The rancher kept working. "I don't care where you're from." "You should." Something in her voice made him finally look up. Moonlight touched her pale green skin softly. Not like a refugee. Not like a traveler. Like royalty trying desperately to hide it. "My daughter was born into an empire older than most worlds," she said quietly. The rancher's eyes narrowed. "And you?" The woman slowly turned toward him. "I am its queen." Silence filled the ranch. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. The rancher stared at her. Then laughed once in disbelief. "A queen sleeping in my barn? A queen running for her life." She stepped closer to the firelight. "There was a betrayal. A warlord seized control of our empire while loyal worlds burned. My daughter is the rightful heir. If she dies, our bloodline dies with her." The rancher's face hardened instantly. "You brought a war to my doorstep." "I brought my child somewhere good men still exist." He stood sharply. "There are no good men left." Pain crossed her expression. "I think there is one." The rancher turned away angrily. Because part of him wanted to believe her. And that terrified him more than the bounty hunters ever could. Later that night, the little girl slept peacefully inside the cabin for the first time. But near dawn, the rancher woke suddenly. The front door stood open. Cold wind moved through the cabin. The child was gone. Outside in the dirt, fresh horse tracks disappeared toward the northern hills. The alien queen stumbled onto the porch in horror. "No!" The rancher's face became stone. Without a single word, he grabbed his rifle, saddled his horse beneath the pale morning sky, and rode hard into the mountains alone. The mountains swallowed the dawn in silence. Cold gray fog rolled between the cliffs while snow drifted lightly across the abandoned mining trails north of the valley. The scarred rancher rode hard through the freezing wind, his horse breathing clouds into the morning air. The child's tracks were easy to follow at first. Too easy. The kidnappers wanted him to chase them. He knew it. Still, he rode on. Because somewhere ahead, a frightened little girl was waiting for someone to come back for her. And he had already failed one child in his lifetime. He would not fail another. The deeper he pushed into the mountains, the older memories became harder to ignore. Burned settlements. Screaming horses. Blood-soaking frontier snow beneath rifle smoke. Years ago, he had arrived too late to save his own family during a raid near the river territories. Too late to save his son. Too late to save anyone. That failure had hollowed him from the inside until only survival remained. But the little alien girl had changed something. Not with grand speeches. Not with destiny. Only with trust. The way she smiled whenever he returned from the fields. The way she carried apples in both tiny hands to feed the horses. The way she believed he was still a good man long after he stopped believing it himself. Snow crunched beneath the horse's hooves as he reached the abandoned mining settlement hidden between cliffs. Then he saw them. Smoke. Horses. Armed men surrounding the ruins of an old silver mine. The rancher dismounted silently, and tied the reins behind a cluster of frozen pines. His wounded shoulder burned sharply beneath his coat, but he ignored it while moving toward the camp through the rocks. Voices echoed faintly ahead. "The warlord pays double if the child's alive." "What about the mother?" Dead's fine. The rancher's eyes darkened. He spotted the little girl beside a wagon near the mine entrance. Her tiny wrists were tied loosely with rope while two armed guards argued nearby. She looked terrified, but alive. The rancher studied the camp carefully. 9 men. Maybe more inside the mine. Too many for a direct fight. Years ago that might have mattered. Now it only made him colder. A guard suddenly grabbed the child's arm roughly. Quiet, little monster! The girl flinched painfully. Something inside the rancher snapped. The first kill happened silently. A knife buried itself into the sniper watching the ridge above camp. Before the body even hit the snow, the rancher fired twice from behind the rocks. 2 more men dropped instantly. Chaos exploded through the mining camp. Gunfire cracked across the mountains while horses screamed and men scrambled for cover. It's him! The rancher! The scarred man moved through smoke and snow like death itself. One hunter rushed him with a rifle. The rancher slammed the axe handle of his revolver into the man's jaw before firing point blank into another attacker behind him. Bullets shattered frozen wood around the camp. The little girl cried out in fear near the wagon. The rancher saw one mercenary grabbing her, trying to flee toward the mine entrance. Without hesitation, he charged through the gunfire. A bullet tore across his side. Another ripped through his coat sleeve. Still he kept moving. He tackled the mercenary violently into the snow and dragged the child free before firing upward toward the cliffs where another sniper waited. The mountains echoed with thunderous shots. Then silence. Snow drifted softly through the ruined camp. Bodies lay scattered between broken wagons and abandoned mining tools. The rancher dropped to one knee breathing heavily, blood soaking through his shirt beneath the cold wind. The little girl immediately threw her arms around him. I knew you'd come, she whispered tearfully. The rancher closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he simply held her tightly against his chest while snow fell around them. No words. Only relief. Then, a deep sound rolled across the mountains above them. Not thunder. Something far larger. The rancher slowly looked upward. Dark shadows moved through the clouds. Massive alien warships descended from the sky. Their enormous silver hulls glowed faintly against the storm clouds while blue lights illuminated the valley beneath them. Wind exploded through the mountains as smaller escort ships swept overhead like hunting falcons. The little girl looked up with wide, shining eyes. They found us. The rancher stared silently. He had seen alien ships before during the old wars. But never like these. These were not war vessels. They were royal. Hours later, the valley surrounding the ranch overflowed with armored alien soldiers. Silver banners carrying glowing symbols waved in the wind, while elegant transport ships landed across the plains. The nearby frontier townspeople gathered at a terrified distance, believing invasion had finally arrived. At the center of it all stood the alien queen. No longer dressed like a refugee. She wore flowing dark royal garments trimmed with silver markings that shimmered softly beneath the evening light. Her white hair moved gracefully in the wind as commanders and soldiers knelt before her one after another. Yet despite the power surrounding her, her eyes searched only for 2 people. Her daughter. And the wounded human beside her. The rancher stood near the porch of his cabin while alien medics wrapped bandages around his side and shoulder. He looked deeply uncomfortable being surrounded by royal guards and kneeling soldiers. The little girl remained close beside him the entire time, refusing to let go of his hand. One elderly commander approached the queen cautiously. Your Majesty, he said, bowing deeply, the fleet is prepared. We can return home before nightfall. Home. The word made the little girl suddenly quiet. She looked up at the rancher sadly. You're not coming with us? The rancher managed a faint smile. Kid, I don't belong on starships. You belong with me. The innocence in her voice nearly broke him. Before he could answer, the queen slowly stepped forward through the silent crowd. Thousands watched. Alien soldiers. Frontier settlers. Mercenaries captured alive. Nobody spoke. The queen stopped only a few feet away from the scarred rancher. For a moment neither moved. Then the little girl squeezed her mother's hand gently and whispered, "Mom, he's the human who saved me twice." Silence spread across the valley. The queen looked toward her daughter, then back toward the wounded rancher standing beneath the fading sunset. Emotion filled her eyes slowly. Not royal pride. Not power. Gratitude. The kind that reaches deeper than words. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, the alien queen lowered herself onto her knees before the human rancher. Gasps spread across the crowd instantly. Even her commanders looked stunned. No ruler knelt. Not to anyone. Especially not to a human frontier man covered in scars and dust. But the queen bowed her head anyway. "You protected my daughter when the stars themselves failed her," she said softly. Her voice carried across the silent valley. "You gave mercy where others gave hatred." The rancher stood frozen. The queen looked up at him with tears shining faintly in her silver eyes. "My people will remember your name long after empires fall." The rancher swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't do it for kingdoms." "I know." The little girl suddenly ran forward again and hugged him tightly around the waist. He slowly rested one rough hand against her silver hair. For the first time in years, warmth touched his tired face. Real warmth. Not forced. Not borrowed. Earned. The queen rose gracefully to her feet. "Come with us," she offered quietly. "You would never suffer again. My empire would honor you above generals and kings." The rancher looked around slowly. At the ranch. The fences. The mountains. The lonely land that had carried his grief for so many years. Then he looked back at the little girl. "You don't need me anymore, kid." Her eyes filled instantly with tears. "Yes, I do." The words nearly destroyed him. But after a long silence, he crouched carefully in front of her despite the pain in his wounds. "You're brave," he told her softly. "Braver than most adults I've met." The child sniffled quietly. Then she removed a tiny glowing pendant from around her neck and placed it carefully into his scarred hand. "So you don't forget me." The rancher closed his fingers around the pendant slowly. "As if I could." At sunset, the royal ships finally rose into the darkening sky. The little girl stood near the open transport doorway beside her mother, waving both hands desperately until the very last second. The rancher remained standing alone outside the cabin while wind moved through the dry frontier grass around him. Higher and higher the ships climbed until they disappeared among the clouds and stars above the valley. Silence returned to the ranch once more. But it no longer felt empty. The scarred rancher looked down at the glowing pendant resting in his rough hand. And for the first time in many years, he no longer felt entirely alone.